let me talk to you now about some of the other issues that you raise in the book. And I think my favorite chapter in the book is that the future is women. And you talk about the transformative impact that we could actually have for an economy like India and for the world if you actually include women, whether it's women's participation in the workforce, etc. You know, we've just had the report come out from the WEF, and 2017 has actually been a bad year because we've actually seen the gender gap stall, and it's not looking particularly good for India, though, even though you argue in your book that as far as discrimination is concerned, perhaps the picture doesn't look that bad for India, given the fact that board seats, etc., at about, what, 12% at this point in time. What is going to be the imperative if we actually want to harness the transformative power of including women in the workforce?
Well, one, it's already being harnessed, but you know...
Not enough.
Well, let me come to that. Look, you know, there are two or three issues that generate a lot of heat, a lot of debate, and people are very casual about the facts behind them. Inequality, as I mentioned, is one of them, where we need to look at the political economy, or the political economy and the ideology of those who are advocating one position or another. Let me come directly to about discrimination against women. And I will leave India aside for the moment, and let's look at the U.S. There's been a long debate about how women's wages in the U.S. are lower than men's wages. And as I point out in the book, June O'Neill, herself a professor, pointed out as far back as 2002 that really the gap between men's wages and women's wages in the 10%. U.S. was less than 10%, yeah. And that 10% was caused by the fact that women had to leave the labor force in order to bear kids. And therefore, experience has a value, and so when they come back into the labor force, they're about 10% lower. That is fast disappearing now. Many countries in the West now give equal time off to both the father and the mother, and I think, you know, that trend is going to continue. Second, it turns out, and I give the example of, you know, SAT scores, various dimensions. We already see any newspaper you pick up at any time in India, it's the women who are outscoring the men, whether in IS exams or in CBSE scores or whatever.
Sure.
So, you know, we have to look beyond what happened in the past and try and look if the world is going to be dominated by education. And women now have equal education to men, and in many parts of the world, more education than men. In other words, the average educational achievement of a woman is higher than that of a man, okay, globally.
Right.
What is going to happen with globalization, with this famous globalization that we talked about earlier? Firms, employers are going to hire women. They are going to be more productive, all other things being equal. And what we see today...
But that's not what the data shows, at least in India. You didn't want to talk about India, but let's talk about
India. Let me talk about India. Okay, so what we have, and one of the indicators of discrimination is board seats of women. And this is, again, a very, you know, Westerners have introduced this. Oh my God, look at India, only 12% of women occupy board seats. And in the US, I think it's about 16 or 17%.
Yeah.
So US isn't that great shakes either. Now, what I show is that actually, let the cat out of the bag, India is #1 in the world in terms of less discrimination against women. No other country favors women as much as India does. Now, let me explain how I get that. Look, in order to get board seats for women, let us assume for a moment, and this is a fair assumption, this is not an assumption that's guiding the result, that you have to be college educated to be on the board seat of a corporation. You buy that?
Sure.
Okay. Second, you have to be in the labor force in order to occupy a board seat. That is, I have to be working. Otherwise, boards are hiring, that may be their family, etc.
Sure.
That's also because of globalization. The family, you know, I will give a job to a family member, you'll soon be out of business, as many people are finding out. So now, if I control for the fact that in India, women's labor force participation rate is only about 32%. And I control for the fact that the labor force participation is that low, and the college educated, we are talking about board seats today, not board seats 10 years ago,
right.
That, you know, or 10 years in the future, rather, that what you find is that the educated supply of women who could be on board seats and the labor force participation all guide together to give India the #1 position. Matter of fact, India is #1 and France is #2, and there are only these two countries in the world that have higher board seats than would be predicted. So we're doing very well. We have discrimination, as I point out, at home, not, and that is also fast changing against women.
Okay, I don't know about that, but
Okay.
but never mind. Let me put that to N.K. Singh. So how do we? What is the economic imperative from a policy perspective, then, Mr. Singh, to be able to actually harness, you know, the transformative power of having more women in the workforce?
Well, you know, I think that Surjit's arguments on the fact that India is doing pretty well is quite persuasive. He could have included the fact that perhaps India may be among the very unique countries where, in fact, now under the amended company law board, you compulsorily need to have one woman on the board of directors. I don't know how many countries have that kind of a law which makes it obligatory.
Plenty do.
I think
Plenty
France
do. Yeah, this kind
but that just came. My data is before that law.
Sure.
Anyway, so that is another additional fact. But the fact remains that notwithstanding some of these very positive features, if you look at more raw data in terms of educational attainment of girls in general, particularly if you look at data from Hindi heartland states, I think that data in terms of dropout ratios, if you look at, for instance, the last ACER report of 2017, in terms of the educational outcome of girl child as compared to others, that data still does not look to be glorious from India's point of view.
You know, I want to move now to talk about a chapter in the book, and that's the idea of the basic income. And you say in the book that it's an idea whose time was yesterday and tomorrow. It's been tried before, we failed miserably, but you believe that this is something that we now need to take forward, and we need to come up with a creative framework around that. What would that be?
It has to be a two-part framework. I think if education is a dominant, everybody's getting educated. So let's first admit to that reality. And, you know, think about a normal distribution curve. There will be people who will be left out. So the bottom 10 to the bottom third of the population. And let's take the bottom 10 first, who are left out. They don't have a job. And I think other than basic income, and there are social problems, there are economic problems, there are guilt problems, all the usual reasons why redistribution is of the essence. And I believe all taxation is a form of redistribution, but we can get into that some other time. So what we have is that the bottom 10%, give or take, will lose out in society, and the government has to now give them transfers and direct benefit transfers. The other 20% or so will have to be, their incomes have to be supplemented through a negative income tax. So, if you will, this will take care of the bottom third, and the rest of the population will go its way. Remember, just 10 years ago, or even now, people talk about a lot of poverty removal, etc. Absolute poverty is a thing of the past in most parts of the world, including in India. I think the problem of low incomes is very much a thing of the present. Joblessness is very much a thing of the present, and that is what societies need to think about and attack, rather than, you know, Garibi Hatao as we did. At that time, 80–90% of the population was poor. Absolutely the right thing. But what I find amazing amongst politicians, etc., in India, and columnists and everybody else, they keep talking about absolute poverty when they should be talking about something radically different, which is low incomes, and the need for the government to have a very different plan of accommodating them in the society than what we had before.
Mr. Singh, you want to add to that? You know, given the context, this is an idea that Arvind Subramaniam has brought up in the economic survey as well. We don't know if the government is going to take this forward in some form or fashion. We hear that it might, but what would be the framework to take Surjit Bhalla's point forward that you would suggest?
No, I think that if you are referring to Mr. Arvind Subramaniam's idea there of a universal basic income, personally, I am not in favor of that. No. And I'm certainly not a proponent of that. But there are other ways in which you can make more decisive intervention than go to the universal basic income route, which I think in some ways is quite flawed. In fact, if you look at some of the supporting documentation given by Pranab Bardhan and Vijay Joshi, who propagated the idea, I think that the assumptions there are really, really very, very tenuous. But without getting into that, where I tend to agree with Surjit's point is that you certainly do require a different kind of a framework, but we would have to give some thought to what that framework would really ideally be. Or in a society where the issue of the educational sort of things are changing so very rapidly.
Yes. Thank you very much for your time. Congratulations, Surjit Bhalla, on your book, and congratulations, Mr. Singh, on your appointment as the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.